Okay, perfect. Great. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Jen Murtazashvili. I am the director at the Center for Governance and Markets and a professor at the School of Public and International Affairs here at the University of Pittsburgh. It's a great honor and pleasure to have with us Dr. Jovana Diković, who is here to present her new book, The Laissez-Faire Peasant, Post-Socialist Rural Development in Serbia. This talk is part of a series that we're running this semester on the future of development assistance. And what we've been trying to do is really explore different modalities of how development is achieved at the local level and how external interventions can really help preserve human agency. And I think there's no book that I've seen recently that tackles this question better than Jovana's book. And I should just say, by introducing Jovana, she's a researcher at the Center for Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability at the University of Zurich, and she specializes in rural and economic anthropology. She has extensive experience across Germany, Serbia, Switzerland, and her work examines how local practices and property relations shape rural development and agricultural policy, especially in the Balkans. But she holds a dear place in our hearts because she was a postdoctoral fellow here at the University of Pittsburgh in the Department of Anthropology, and that's where we first had the opportunity to get to know her work. And I would just also encourage you, as you're reading about this book, to download it because it is an open source book available for free, and to download it as she's describing it. It's just a really great opportunity. So, Jovana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jennifer, very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. As you already said, the same way how I have the special part in your hearts, you and Pittsburgh also has very special place in my heart. I also have to mention that when I was at the University of Pittsburgh, I was intensively working on my book. And one of the conversations that was really so transformational was exactly with Ilya Murtashvili. So I think that the way how we discussed, the local ways of ordering things and local norms that play important place in organizing development, but also organizing orders was fascinating for me. And then through reading his book, I was also discovering, completely unknown side, which I definitely felt that I had to incorporate in my book. So my presence in Pittsburgh was right at the time. So thanks for this, and also thank you for inviting me to present my book, and welcome to other audience here at this webinar. So as Jennifer said, I will be talking about my latest book, The Laissez-Faire Peasant, Post-Socialist Rural Development in Serbia. And I will be firstly explaining the setting of the research and of the book, and then I will be moving to explaining the book itself. The Laissez-Faire Peasant is a book about 3 villages in northern Serbia. If you look at this southeastern part of Vojvodina province, is exactly the place where I conducted my research. So I looked at 3 villages in Vojvodina province, which is known as very fertile and flat area, and in other terms is also called Serbian breadbasket. So the villages where I conducted research from 2013 to 2017 had a different ethnic and economic composition. The biggest village in the area was the village of Gai, and it has approximately 3,000 people of different ethnic origin. And the Serbs make their majority, while Czechs, Hungarians, Romanians, and Roma form minorities. In other 2 villages, which are significantly smaller, and have between 300 and 400 residents. Serbs are mainly the most dominant population. What is common for all three villages is that agriculture is a dominant occupation. Basically, every household in the village is directly or indirectly related to agriculture, and households cultivate on average between 5 and 20 hectares. Slightly over 30% of the population cultivate from 20 to 70 hectares, and only a few cultivate more than 100 hectares. Some 30 to 35% of the village works solely in agriculture, whereas other combine agriculture with other occupations. Professionals, for example, such as doctors, teachers, clerks, usually do not possess the land and they do not work in agriculture. And the Roma are also in the category of small percentage of the population, which we could term as landless. But the reasons why they lack land are different of nature and are related to their social marginalization. What I also need to stress here is that I'm using the term peasants in the book and throughout the book as well. So the term peasant for some might be a bit misleading, but I felt that I really need to explain the reasons why I'm using this term. So it's a nemic term, peasants. In Serbian, it's called seljak, is a nemic term. And it means that it actually refers to every person who cultivates the land. So every person who cultivates the land in Serbian would be called a peasant, regardless of the scope of the land he or she cultivates. So a peasant is anyone who cultivates from 5 to 100 hectares. So peasants does not refer to those who are poor, but only to those who cultivate the land. To get a better sense of the very locally rooted understanding of the peasants and the local population being comfortable with this term, I will tell you a little anecdote from the field. So I was walking with a friend of mine who is also a peasant, and then we discussed one agricultural policies at that time, and then I asked how agricultural producers referred to this specific agricultural policy. And I used agricultural producers as a value neutral term, but she seemed as she was confused with the term agricultural producers I was using. And then she stopped and turned towards me and she said, "You mean peasants?" And I said, "Yes, I mean peasants." So from that moment on, I kept using the term peasants, and I also applied it in the book and explained in the book why I'm using it. So now I'm converting to the content of the book. So Serbia, as you already heard, is a country where currently 40% of the population lives in rural areas and where 80% work exclusively in agriculture. Over the last 100 years, Serbia was a capitalist monarchy, then a socialist state, then an autocratic state, and a liberal democracy, with serious shortfalls of 2012. But common to all these phases has been an institutional attempt to reform peasants and agriculture through numerous agricultural and rural policies. The aim was always strikingly similar: to transform the peasants following the modernist conceptions of these four historical epochs. So in monarchy, the priority was given to private over common property and market economy. In socialist state, the priority was over collective, over private property and central planned economy. In authoritarian state, it was prioritization on privatization of socialist estates and growing indifference toward private property and agricultural households. Whereas in liberal democratic phase, the priority was given to professionalization of agriculture through agricultural associations, cooperatives, insurance schemes, reducing informal trade, fostering export-oriented agriculture, and so on. Nevertheless, numerous accounts on Serbian agriculture provide robust evidence, according to which state agricultural policies over the past 100 years have failed to achieve the imagined goals of the transformation and modernization of the peasantry. What's more controversial, it is that Serbian agriculture and peasants have not remained still. They have been developing exactly in those sectors which the state explicitly wanted to reduce or put under its control, or against the goals it proclaimed. Notable examples would be expansion and strengthening of peasant private property during socialism, or peasants' massive refusing of agricultural and pension insurance as of 2000, or massive neglecting of agricultural associations and cooperatives also as of 2000, to name but a few. Yet, despite the failure of agricultural policies in Serbia and the remarkable development in sectors which the state did not envision, Serbian public discourse continuously laments over weak peasants. Likewise, in the peasant and rural development scholarship, peasants are too often portrayed as vulnerable and manipulated populations. The three statements from my peasant informants, however, took me on a journey of examination into what we really know about peasants and to question the dominant rural development paradigms. Land never stays uncultivated, no matter the political and economic conditions. Peasants cannot be ruined, they can only have more or less. And the last one, if peasants look after the village will look after them. The main characters of my book, small and middle peasants from 3 villages in Vojvodina province, and the observation of their everyday practices made me wonder how we can explain the peasant resilience, which is displayed not only in these statements, but also in maintaining and thriving of peasants' households and their local communities. Peasant resilience is also displayed in their contestation and rejection of the state policies for rural development. I also wondered how we can explain the rural development if we depart from the premise that it does not happen through state planning and rural development policies. Focusing on state planning and expansion of the institutions that support development through implementation of regulations and bureaucrats, which is of course a modus operandi of agricultural and rural policies, does not tell us how rural development occurs on the ground. The 3 quotes were crucial for providing me with new perspectives on the relationship between the peasants and their land and the local regulatory mechanisms that attain individual and collective well-being. The land contains 2 fundamental components, individual and social. The individual component is contained in the land as a livable asset, crucial for providing a sense of autonomy for peasants. Working on the land on their own terms, commonly captured in sentences being my own boss or my land, my responsibility, but also food production and sustainable capacities of their households, provide peasants with the psychological and economic sense of direct control of their life. The social component of land and ownership is contained in the dignity of manual labor and own sweat, through which peasants earn their local reputation and because of which they are accountable to their community. For peasants, earning dignity means not going below the local minimum set for the state of household, land and livestock, environmental impact on the neighboring fields, and participation in communal events and responsibilities. Preserving dignity inevitably contains the elements of competition which motivate peasants' aspirations for maintaining and enlarging their households and social standing in the village. Dignity is highly esteemed in the local context because It enables the creation of dense social ties, which are capable of enforcement of local norms across various arrangements. Apart from the land, there are additional factors that shape self-understanding of peasants and their views. Life on the periphery contains the peasant's feeling of being neglected by the state. It rationalizes prioritization of elaborate village ethics and local norms in governing their everyday practices, from buying and selling, crediting, local support networks to helping the poor. Life on the periphery strengthens also self-governing and self-reliance mechanisms in which individualism, skepticism, and distrust toward the state play a significant role. Taken together, a sense of autonomy and dignity, life on the periphery, individualism, skepticism, and distrust generate what I call in the book the laissez-faire mentality of peasants. The concept explains the autonomous actions of peasants, which are elemental for understanding their reliance on the one side, understanding their resilience on the one side, and moving beyond the constraints imposed by the state regulations in agriculture on the other. The autonomous actions of peasants simultaneously skew and or reject development plans for agriculture and rural population. Let me demonstrate a few examples of failure that represent the pillars of state rural development programs. One of the projects of tighter integration of the peasants in the state system and rural development programs was obligatory pension insurance. But peasants reject paying obligatory pension insurance and are currently the biggest debtors to the state pension system. They consider it a futile investment. They instead rely on their kinship and land capital as their retirement provision. Another example is direct trade, which involves trade in the black market and unreported transactions. Despite numerous state attempts to curtail such practices, including penalties for those who continue to do so, many peasants trade their produce directly. It is seen as the most natural right of the producers and as their way of staying connected with the customers and their wants and information beyond their villages. Through direct trade, peasants maintain their autonomy and importance in the marketplace and bridge the food shortages in times of crisis or inflation. Another prominent example shows how peasants and local arrangements skew the goals of agricultural subsidies, causing the shift of the flow of subsidies toward agriculturally inactive populations and non-agricultural purposes. Namely, the biggest suppliers of the land to be leased are widows and retired people. By renting out their land to peasants, they also require all or half of the subsidies. Essentially, subsidies flow to people based on their land ownership, not because of their agricultural investments. Numerous other examples show that subsidies did not fulfill their purpose because they ended up in building houses or renovations, buying cars, organizing weddings and birthday celebrations. In other words, subsidies were used as investments in maintaining the social standing of the peasants in the community. Next example is the crop insurance market. Despite the fact that the state subsidizes 40% of individual premiums, the insurance market is poorly developed. Peasants massively refuse to insure their crops because they only trust their own risk management techniques. The last example is the organization of agricultural cooperatives and associations. The state was incentivizing peasants to organize and join agricultural cooperatives by providing generous subsidies. The cooperatives and associations are promoted as the backbone for strengthening peasant influence in the market and in lobbying. But because of the peasants' very sophisticated understanding of cooperation, they massively reject joining them. Peasants support common arrangements such as village ceremonies, celebrations, or shared work, that is, arrangements where the consequences of not participating may have a collective toll. But by not being part of the cooperative or association, peasants protect their autonomy and social image, preventing in such a way any potential social exposure. These examples aimed to demonstrate the laissez-faire mentality. It manifests in situations when peasants try to find their own, often informal ways of doing things and accessing resources or cooperating without or in spite of state regulations. But the laissez-faire mentality should not be understood as an anarchistic desire to not be controlled or governed by any authority. The concept, in fact, explains how peasants in relational situations, be it with the state or with each other, pursue or strive for their own autonomous way of doing things. In other words, the concept explains the social climate in the Serbian villages marked by high levels of flexible and spontaneous arrangements which contribute to both individual but also community well-being. Laissez-faire means let be, let pass. With this book, I also wanted to show that informal institutions that are a sublimation of spontaneity and the virtues are conducive to individual and collective betterment and well-being in the countryside. I'll mention just a few local institutions such as credit on trust. You buy something now and you pay later. Or gleaning, allowing the poor to collect leftover crop on the private property after the first harvest, which belongs to the owner of the field. Or shared work and village ceremonies. Or buying practices. So according to them, local people mainly don't want to enlarge their property by buying the land of a family that faced the bankruptcy or other misfortune because it is considered unethical. Each of these practices ensures the minimum threshold for community cooperation and dignity. On the other hand, institutions of land ownership, hard work, thriftiness, householder and landowner, gazde or domaćin in Serbian, motivate people to maintain and improve their households and standing in the village. These practices ensure dignity of the person and also entail entrepreneurial design, which motivates people to better cultivate and care for the land, households, and livestock, and that sharing of knowledge, but also experience and support for the community are not only expected, but also nurtured. These informal institutions, in fact, deeply mirror the ideas of indigenous development. The crucial component of an indigenous development is in the following. Success, although may be individual, it is meaningful only in the community. Those who are considered successful peasants, despite their existing rivalries, feel both obliged and honored to share their experiences with their peers, to support the newcomers in agriculture and confirm loyalty to their village in numerous ways. Unlike state agricultural policies that focus only on established peasants, the endogenous development is principally egalitarian, laissez-faire, and virtuous. It spreads horizontally by involving diverse categories of people, some of whom may not be skilled in agriculture. Endogenous development is thus more inclusive than state-led plans for agriculture and rural development. Moreover, it is more long-term oriented than the state plans, which change too quickly for the peasant's taste. The common theme among peasants I encountered was that they do not relate their thriving, no matter how minimal or splendid it may be, to any of the existing state incentives in agriculture. They rather explained it through intangible factors such as local and village values, aspirations for maintaining and enlarging their autonomy through land ownership, and preserving social standing in the village. There is an ethic of becoming a better, not necessarily richer peasant, although these are not mutually exclusive categories. And through that, the land is better cultivated and cared for. In Serbia, there is a paradox in which agriculture is slowly growing, while state policies for agricultural and rural development are facing a continuous collapse. I explained this paradox through a phenomenon of social imitation in the villages, which generates a virtuous circle in which peasants, through mutual affection, cooperation, and admiration, push each other to higher achievements. In such a context, the state visions of rural development are not relevant. In the book, therefore, I question the mainstream understanding of development advocated by policymakers and rural development scholars. Those conceptions evolve around the meticulous planning of every developmental move, resting on the belief that the change of rural livelihoods may be achieved mainly through plans and reforms. It is followed by an exponential increase in new institutions such as regulations, bureaucrats, laws, and supported by measurements and statistics aiming to regulate and further monitor progress and growth or the preparedness of the peasants for the future. Yet a couple of rare studies have shown that growth is hard to measure and that it is even harder to know what drives it and therefore to make policies to make it happen. So I question the idea of planning embedded in the mainstream development paradigm. The biggest problem of development lies in the systematic narrowing down of available alternatives of potential carriers of development and acknowledging their role in enabling development. We gradually end up in an absurd situation where we cannot see the alternative to planning. In contrast to rich knowledge about leading concepts of modernization and rural development promoted by governments and international organizations, their alternatives are insufficiently known. By studying the alternative conceptions of development and the local arrangements, we may find out why some rural communities develop and others do not, even in cases where they live under similar conditions. A great body of literature does not provide satisfactory answers to these questions because its focus has been too long on the formal institutional conditions, which are believed to be the only enablers of development. In the book, I show that the misconception beliefs ingrained in state policies continuously produce wrong incentives that do not enable development, but rather corruption, nepotism, and clientelism in the local setting. In the Laissez-Faire Peasant, I have attempted to widen the perspective and inspire conversations about alternatives to planning. I looked at and explained development from the perspective of those who are, in the discourse of planned rural development, recognized only as exclusive recipients of development or as its victims. That is, peasants and their mechanisms that enable spontaneous development on the ground. This book shows that peasants can thrive and live well in ways that are incompatible with those proposed by the state rural development policies. Finally, the book contests dominant portrayal of peasants as weak and disadvantaged groups, despite massive failures of rural development projects in Serbia and in some other countries. The existing limitations in a theoretical approach to the peasantry point to the fact that intangible aspects, such as local and individual values, aspirations, attitudes, and norms, get overlooked in response to peasants' low compliance to the rural development plans. The attention is rather focused on the institutional factors that hamper cooperation between the peasants and the state. I call for rethinking the power relations between the state and the peasants. And by diving into the manifestations of the laissez-faire mentality of peasants, I invite the readers to reconsider the assumptions of peasant subordination to the state or markets, and instead find in their agencies the answers to peasants' resilience and fulfillment. So thank you for your attention. I hope I kept 30 minutes as you said, Jennifer.
It's great. Thank you so much. This book, I think, does so much to demystify, to explain, to give people in rural areas, the peasants you describe, agency,
Mm.
right? And it's often something that is so missing when we think about rural development or how we think about development projects, how we think about planning. Um, and, one of the questions I had for you is that, you argue that the expansion of the state into these areas led to more clientelism and more corruption. Do you think that, by doing this, that aid or government support in post-socialist context is actually like a minimal state? Should we be rethinking our visions of the state to create an environment that might be safer, for the poor? That it's very counterintuitive what you're suggesting is that a potentially more limited government might be one that is, um, better for the peasants.
As a blasphemy for social sciences, I advocate exactly this. So I think that in rural areas, and especially among the poor, there are so many constraints which are imposed on them because of the state infrastructure and state systems that translate from local from top down. So the problem is that very often poor and the peasants themselves on a daily basis face with so many constraints. But only if we reconsider lifting constraints where they are really making lives miserable, including for the poor and for the peasants, and just enable the minimum, as you said. Like I often talked to my interlocutors, and I asked them, what would you do differently, or how would you imagine different conditions in the agriculture? And they said, look, I mean, we just need infrastructure, we just need a rule of law, because this is what is not functioning in Serbia. Infrastructure is hardly covering every village in Serbia. But the markets and the ways how they trade with each other, they know how to trade, they know how, they have the nerve for this. So they say, just give us the rule of law and infrastructure, the rest we are going to do on ourselves. So I think that, yeah, definitely, instead of providing more development and more education for the peasants, I know it sounds blasphemic, but I think peasants are absolutely apt for the development. They also have their own visions of development, and I think it's not counterintuitive, even though it may seem so, because I think that our vision is very much spoiled by the very dominant presentations of the peasants' victimhood. Somehow you always, I mean, we as researchers, and this is what I also explain in the book, this is how I started my research. I started my research expecting that I will find there desperate people who are just lamenting over insufficient institutional frameworks. And if these institutional frameworks were just better, they would be thriving. But what I considered was completely opposite. They were deconstructing, and they were putting on collapse all these state institutions because they were not fit for their visions of development and for their growth.
So then, what would you say then, to someone maybe here in the audience or anywhere who works in the development industry, right? Who works for an NGO? I don't know. I think there probably is still a development industry left in Europe. We are ours in the United States, with the elimination of USAID. Looks very different than it did before, but we still have the World Bank, we still have multilateral organizations, the UN. And I know they've been very active in Serbia and in Eastern Europe in general. What would you say to someone who works in the development industry or works for a ministry, for example, in Serbia, who genuinely believes planning can work if it's done right?
Well, I would definitely advise that they should go to the communities that they are planned to develop. to lift from poverty. And just to be clear, I don't believe, I mean, I believe that all these people have very benevolent intentions. And very often they have very nice ideas about how they should support these people in developing or in pursuing development. But the problem is that very often their visions of planning do not match with the poor or with the populations that they are targeting. So I would suggest that they first go and talk to these local people, try to understand what they identify as the most important aspects that need to be changed. Because after the development aid or after the state programs, it is those people who are going to stay and live in this countryside and in these deprived areas. So we need to understand what they want, what they really desperately need. Very often, these are not little development programs that are going to last from 3 to 5 years and then disappear immediately after the funding stops. But we need to rethink really the long-term prospects. And what I would advise to any development worker, but also any development scholar, is to go to the communities and ask what local people identify as constraints. And then work on the removing of the constraints, not necessarily giving money to or giving, funding the projects. So in my view, that should be, the purpose, new purpose of development organizations. And of course, sometimes you really need institutional funding and support for removing the constraints, and also collaboration on the part of those who have the interest in maintaining those constraints.
So I think that gets me into some of the methods of your work and the book. You spent years in Gaj,
Yes.
and the surrounding villages. And can you just say a little bit what surprised you the most about living there? Is there anything that you mentioned that, you had these elements of surprise. What did you have to unlearn? And then how did you navigate writing about people who were so used to being portrayed in a certain way, right? As being sort of helpless. That's what I took away from much of your book, right? Is that there was this, people were used to being described in a certain way, or even, through with history of socialism, and post-socialism having been dealt with by the state in a certain way.
Yes, so the thing was first when I arrived to a village, I just had good context. For Serbia, village has been elected in scholarship for a very, very, very long period of time, maybe between 60s, and these are books written by local scholars and also 2 to 3 foreign scholars who were describing the socialists. But after that, after the collapse of the village and the collapse of socialism, there was literally not much writing, especially not in a foreign scholarship. So there was a black hole about Serbian village and about what people do there, especially because very often we think that people in Serbian villages are poor, are deprived, are unhappy, and so on. So the point was, when I arrived at the village, first of all, people were completely surprised. Why am I interested in the village? Because people in the villages themselves thought that they are not a topic at all, because somehow they are completely forgotten, either by the state on the one hand, because the state focuses on them. This is their perception. The state focuses on them only when when the political campaigns are going on, or when the elections are approaching. So the state presence is more obvious than in other situations and cases. Whereas on the other hand, scholars are also not quite interested in writing about Serbian. So the way how they were surprised by me, my presence in the village was one of the surprising moments. for me, the second very interesting moment that literally turned for 180 degrees my research was the statement with which I opened the book, that land never stays uncultivated, no matter the political or economic conditions. So that somehow was very interesting to me to understand that all my theoretical tools that I was equipped with were just collapsed in the moment when I heard this sentence, because I came preordained to think that similarly what Akçemoglu and Robinson say, that if you have good institutions, you will have the progress and development. If you don't have good institutions, you will not have progress and development. But in the village, I saw that there were not good institutions. There was no rule of law, there was no infrastructure, but nevertheless, the agriculture was growing and was developing. So this discrepancy was really a very turning point in my research when I tried to think hard how these two can be reconciled, how the growing agriculture can be explained without supporting institutions in the field. So I think that was the most important aspect that literally changed my way of thinking about development and changed my perception of the peasants. And your third question is how peasants themselves reacted to being portrayed not as victims, but rather as agents, innovative, active agents in their own lives and in the local communities. I think that this is something that they intuitively feel, but this is also something which very often is not present in media. So somehow I think that also in public discourse, very often you have so much of the presentations of poor and also of the peasants as incapable of doing something on their own, or as people who are constantly reliant on the state, etc., etc. Partly and only superficially, this is true. This is true. Because throughout my talk, I explained to you that they are using or abusing mechanisms that are provided by the state. But at the same time, they have very sophisticated levels of cooperation with the state. So they exactly know when they are going to cooperate with the state, when it is beneficial for them, and when they are not going to cooperate with the state, and when it is not beneficial for them. So this is something that I try to encapsulate and explain the situations, the context in which they feel themselves as powerful, and explain better when they see and feel themselves as less powerful. And mostly the cases when they see themselves as less powerful is in the situation when they confront the state institutions, or when they go to courts, and when they are losing the courts, and when they simply feel that the rule of law is not functioning and is not working for not only for them but for Arab state is something that they really struggle with.
So, I mean, there's so much here to talk about, and I just wanted to let the audience know if you have questions, you can, oh, there are some in the chat. A great question here. Two opposite points. First, and this is from Don Van Atta in the chat. First, what is your definition of development?
Mm-hmm.
And then second, your comments surprise me simply because there's a long-running argument about how to give rural people agency in development, particularly what is known as participatory rural development. It sounds as though you're making a simple identify between social estate planning and the work of IFIs, that you're conflating the two.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to this? I have my own answer to this question, but I would curious to hear what you have to say.
Thanks for this question. So, development is perceived, what I describe as development is, first of all, that there are official understanding of development and those local understood ways of development. So, according to these official understanding of development, these are programs of the support that would enforce certain aspects of the society or improvements in the society that would enable local communities to thrive or catch up with whatever the state or international organization or any other development organizations thinks it's important and necessary to be changed and adapted to the local population. And the second question was the idea of simplifying, I think, the understanding of scholarship in where there is a lot of participatory rural development. So my comment here is I'm saying that in the book also, I'm saying that there was a scholarship about rural development, but the focus of the scholarship about rural development was mainly focused on the planning. So the participatory rural development is also coming to the local communities with the ideas of plans that, you know, the local communities are coming together because someone external from the community comes with the initiative to organize, to get together and develop and work together on the development. But basically, this is not spontaneous development. So what I rather try to explain in the book is that I'm focused on examining the spontaneous ways of development, how people, without any external intervention, understand development, how it comes into being.
Yeah, and
Maybe
I want to
Jennifer, you
echo.
can also comment on this if you,
Yeah, I think we're
because I'm
having
interested to
some
hear what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with a lot of the sentiments, and just from my experience, both as a development practitioner and
Okay.
studying many of these things, that that this
Mhm.
notion of participatory development, number one, a lot of this sidesteps formal institutions. So why do we need participatory development if we have democracies?
Yeah.
It never really has made much sense to me. These often become parallel structures that try to deal with either authoritarian regimes or corrupt regimes. Um, and they create, and then there's very little I have found about participatory development. I know, to quote Jovana here, this is blasphemy, but there is very little I have found about much participatory development that's actually bottom up. It is
Mm.
NGOs telling communities that they have to participate in a certain way in order to get something from them. And this is an inherently unequal relationship. And it is not really based on grassroots participation or indigenous forms of collective action. Often these participatory schemes, they come and they go, they leave when the donor leaves, and is about contestation for development assistance, which leads to kind of more rentier dynamics, right? Leads to more capture, leads, I think, to a lot of unintended negative consequences. So one of the purposes of this project that we've been running is to understand how development assistance programs can actually enable human agency. And CDD, community driven development, that's the kind of the framework that the World Bank has used. Other participatory development schemes, um, I I think have very questionable impact. And often, from my work in Afghanistan, we found that they actually did more harm than good. They actually undermined local community governance more than they strengthened it. In fact, there was randomized control trials that found when you had participatory development projects, uh, this undermined local collective action hurt governance more than it helped. So it's not even a question of doing no harm. It's a lot of it's these programs can actually exacerbate existing inequalities, existing challenges, um, and then they create parallel structures that are imposed upon communities which are really just trying to navigate and create their own resilient systems. And I think that resilience is something that really comes across quite strongly in your book, Jovana, is the resilience. That term is used in so many different ways, and I know it's used by your center. And I was wondering actually if you could say a little bit more about that. How do people have so many different conceptions of resilience. Um, you work in a center on resilience. To me, your book is about resilience. Do you have anything to say about that, about how we sort of commonly understand that concept and how your concept of that might sort of differ from what we normally hear?
So the resilience is something that we usually hear these days a lot, and the resilience is this and that. I mean, many people take different notions of the resilience. I think my notion of resilience is not extravagant, or it's not many different from other people how they usually use it in their everyday conversations or understanding. What I have considered by resilience is plainly the mechanisms which are deeply engraved in individuals and the communities, which help them to maintain their living conditions, but which also are very important for, preparing them for the future, and also preparing them for different difficult times that they may face. And also. I also think that the way how people recover after certain difficult times is also something which is important for understanding regarding the resilience. So this is very comprehensive definition, and very recently I got the question on my another book talk whether resilience is something which I use just because it is a very popular term, or it is the resilience that is indeed reflected through the local community. So I think that those three quotes that I gave to you in the presentation, that land never stays cultivated, is one of the examples of the resilience. The second is that a peasant cannot be ruined, he can have only more or less, is the second example of resilience. And the third is that if the peasant looks after the village will look after them. So in my understanding, resilience is deeply engraved in the community, but also in individuals. It's very relational. People know exactly what they should do and what are they supposed to do in order to maintain their resilience or to achieve their resilience. But at the same time, it is quite important that those senses are also engraved in the language itself. So I think linguistically, these sentences also capture the ideas of the local ideas of the resilience.
No, I think this term is so, I think, overused right now. And there's a sense that, what you highlight is that resilience is something that exists. And
Yes,
others really view resilience as something that should be built, right, by external actors.
yes.
And,
Let's say that if
yeah,
that is a difference, then probably that would be the major difference.
yeah. And I think that, too often we don't understand resilience as an asset that people can deploy. Rather, external actors, whether it's donors or governments, are trying to build some idealized form of what they think resilience should look like. And by doing so, they often undermine local resilience that exists. It doesn't even have to be local, it could be regional, it could be trade networks, right? So many different aspects of it that are, self-governing and will continue and are really quite able to withstand traumas or natural disasters or conflict or whatever but often external efforts to, and I think this is one of the takeaways from your book, is that these external efforts to strengthen them actually can hurt. And
Yeah.
not just from, an economic perspective, but actually from a human dignity perspective. And I know we just have a couple of minutes left, but I was wondering if you could say something just a little bit about that human aspect, right? Uh, we've covered so much ground on the theoretical side and the empirical side and your methods. I was wondering if you could just say a little bit about sort of the human dignity side, and also just to tell us a little bit about what you're working on now and what we can expect to read from you in your next projects.
So yes, the human the dignity of the peasant is also a very important topic, especially in the local areas. Um, as I said, it's a social side of having land ownership, of running a dignified life, or being integrated into the community. So there are different understanding how the dignity is maintained and preserved regardless of the category of the population we are talking about. So, for example, the dignity also plays very important role, and local people also try to enable the space for fulfilling dignified life, even for the poor and even for those who are considered marginalized. So I will just mention the example of gleaning. So gleaning is very untypical, and probably in the States you might have something similar. I know that in other European countries this custom is already either disappearing or completely disappeared. But in Serbia, for example, after the first harvest on a private property, the poor are allowed to glean. So basically, the custom allows that the private property, which is private in regular circumstances, temporarily converts into the common property. So the people are allowed to come to the property and glean the leftovers so that they can collect this, sell on the markets, and have their own income. But the aspect which is here important here is that the poor also need to invest the labor into the collecting leftovers, which means that they are not being given anything for free. So they also need to invest a bit of labor so that they can also maintain the dignity. And I think this is also valued. Dignity is tightly connected with the labor, with hard work, with also thriftiness, and all these individual aspects are bringing understanding of the dignity in the local community, which should never let you or your family to go below the certain standards which is set in the local community. Either it is a household or the state of your livestock or the state of your farms or fields, whatsoever. So I would say that in local context, dignity is really tightly connected with the hard work, with work in general, and also by enabling other people to practice their work, to practice the freedom of work, and also to enjoy the fruits of this work, brings people not only social admiration, but also brings people with sense of being accepted and being dignified. Yes, and the last question, what I'm working on now. So I'm currently finishing a book on why development cooperation projects fail in Kosovo. So this is the book that I'm about, let's say, I'm very enthusiastic here about to finish. And yeah, we are also in the center, we are also starting the new project, which will be in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we are going to investigate there how locally embedded company, which is called Pharmakina, is important for enabling local growth, and in what ways local representatives and the locally embedded multinational companies can play a crucial role for providing the infrastructures and also means for the people to practice their own entrepreneurships and to practice their own businesses and also to maintain their own lives. So it's quite an interesting project, and I'm looking forward to it in the next months to come.
Great, Jovana. Thank you so much for this. It was just a real honor and pleasure to have you here and just to hear from your insights. And we're really, look to follow the work that comes next. But I do hope that those who have had the chance to hear your presentation really spread the word about this book, because I think it's really important work, especially in the field of anthropology. We rarely see books with this kind of theoretical framing. It's very innovative. And just want to congratulate you again on the book and just thank you again for taking the time to be with us today. And we hope to welcome you back to Pittsburgh one day soon, to your second home.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jennifer, and to everyone who stayed until the very end. And thank you for offering me the opportunity to present my book and talk about it. It is always a pleasure meeting you and all the pit staff. So I'm also looking forward that we are going to see each other soon in face to face. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Jovana.
Thanks a lot.